Network Automation Nerds podcast.
Hello and welcome to Network Automation Nerds podcast, a podcast about network automation, network engineering, Python, and other technology topics. I'm your host, Eric Cho. Today on the show, we continue our conversation with Anthony and Christian about going from completely manual network operation to robust, usable, and practical network automation in a relatively short time. Last week, we covered kind of their introductory and their first project. If you want to catch up on that, the link is in the show notes. So this week, we're going to continue to explore more of their operations, their lessons learned, and all the best practices. I'm excited to dive into it. So let's get into it. Well, I guess welcome back, Christian and Anthony.
Thanks, Eric. Glad to be here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think last week we, obviously in part one, I should say that we talked about, where we left off was lessons learned on the first project. And you guys brought up very good points about, maybe think ahead on the device capabilities and other tool sets that you have in the ground. Do you want to give us a little recap of, what that first project was about, Anthony?
Sure. So effectively, we wanted to reduce toil, streamline processes, increase configuration consistency, so on and so forth.
Yeah,
right? All the typical things you think of when you think automation and orchestration. And so we hyper-focused on router replacements, right?
Yep.
So let's streamline router replacements. Get structured data from the old router, render it through new templates, push it to the new one, integrate some IPAM data from our IPAM system, so on and so forth.
Yeah, so I think that's great. I mean, if I remember correctly, you were talking about you were going through a network refresh. So that was like a perfect opportunity because it's not a brownfield; it's almost a greenfield, right? So you're more free to do any kind of experiments or operation. Not that they're easy. I'm just saying like there's less I guess strings attached to those kind of projects. So that's great. So after that, what are some of the day two operations? You mentioned the lessons learned. So were you able to implement some of those, I guess, from lessons learned afterwards?
So once we got this thing off the ground, we definitely had some post-deployment discussions. We explored a few things. We kept trying to expand the tool in new ways. This is where somewhere, in this era, we started looking at, declarative configurations.
Okay.
Right. So for day two operations, how do we manage configs with structured data? And when you talk about merge versus replace, that's a big thing. That's where you really start finding some hardware limitations.
Yeah.
Not all vendor operating systems can handle a full config replace, right?
Right.
And that's not, uninstall or uninstall everything and reinstall, your new configs, right? It's just resolve the deltas between your running configuration and your intended configuration.
Yeah, back to that state again, right?
Exactly. We started getting this mindset where, okay, running state and intended state, they should be the same, right? And if they're not, maybe report on it, send a message to somebody, say, hey, there's a delta that needs to be resolved,
Yeah.
So tracking state, like we were saying, is pretty difficult, right? Like, for example, if you've got a trunk port or something with a long list of VLANs and you need to remove a VLAN and add a VLAN. Well, imperatively, you would log in, you would run a command to remove the VLAN, and then you'd run another command to add the VLAN.
Right.
Well, if you were automating that, you would have to track state of the VLANs on that interface, right? So you'd have to know what VLANs are there. So if the one that shouldn't be there has to be removed, like, okay, you got to remove it first. And we built a little tooling around that, and it was pretty difficult and not super user-friendly. Right, this form would pull in the VLAN data, and the user would say, all right, like I'm going to remove this one and then add this one. I think the extra step of tracking state and having to remove a thing really adds a lot of overhead on the whole process. I think if we could, at this point, we're like, okay, if we can just boil it down to, let's define the intended state, and that's all the user has to do. Like, how should things be configured? And then, we'll take care of the rest.
Yeah. What about you, Christian? Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I can. So, yeah, I remember at one point during this, we started to try and build on the existing tooling we had. As Anthony said, we were looking for something where we could define intended state of a device configuration. And I remember we explored with the existing tool we had for developing Jinja and YAML and trying to save full device configurations as YAML files and use that as the source of truth for the configuration data. Um, it got kind of complex because we have lots of devices. So we had, we would eventually end up with like 200 something YAML files. And I remember one day whiteboarding with Anthony, we were trying to build out, like, rather than use a database, we were trying to use the file structure on the Linux server. And we made folders for like each vendor, right? We had Juniper, we had Arista, we had Brocade folders. And underneath that, we tried to divide things up into like access switches and then tier switches, and trying to organize our YAML files in a file tree that would make sense so that you could easily find them on the front end of our application. But it was not super user friendly. It was in the direction that we wanted to go, but it didn't seem like it hit all the right notes for what we were looking for.
Yeah, I think I've seen two different approaches, right? One is what you describe as you organize them by function and then by vendor, even just because each between vendors they're so different. And I've seen where in environments that it's relatively simple, and then they organize them by features. So, like these are all the L2s that I want, right? Regardless of the vendor. So I would have these L2, and let's just say this port needs to be in this VLAN. And I will have that declarative on the like the VLAN, but I will have another operations that to check whether this is a Brocade, a Juniper, a Arista or whatever, and then accordingly apply the necessary configuration. So I think those are kind of the two approaches I've seen. But you're right, this is not an easy problem, right?
Yeah, it's not, and especially with the fact that we were trying to build the front end for it and make that nice and clean and usable.
Yeah.
And we were trying to handle the back end and the data storage. It was becoming a bit overwhelming. The code base was kind of messy at this point, and it was hard to manage.
Oh my God, that's your hero's journey right now. You've hit the obstacle. Anthony, bring us back and give us a happy ending, please.
So we get this tool off the ground. We're flying the plane. Everyone's using it. A typical some process that would normally take like a week or so.
Yeah,
it's now being done in 20 or 30 minutes. And when we install the new routers, for example, it works the first time, right? Your OSPF adjacencies form, great. IBGP forms, awesome. TACX works, incredible, every single time. So we got a ton of value out of that tool.
Yeah.
So with our lessons learned, we made some career moves here. At some point, long story short, we both ended up at Northeastern University, where we currently another higher ed, and they were kind of in a similar scenario. So we kind of had a hard reset, right? So it's like, okay, let's do this again, and this time let's see if we can do it better. Now, in the space between working for the first higher ed and Northeastern, we discovered Netbox and Nautobot.
Nice.
A guy on the RC team was like, you guys need to look at this, right? Like, you can do rack elevations and cable runs and devices. Like, this is, you're currently working with a sea of spreadsheets, right? Distributed spreadsheets all over the place. Like, why not use something like this instead?
Yeah.
So after some exploration and tinkering, we leaned in on Nautobot and discovered that Nautobot really is a good platform to do what we had already done at University of Georgia.
Yeah.
And the good structured framework is built on Django. It's got a database, clean GUI, and it's extensible. And there's a rich ecosystem of plugins, great community support. So that's the direction we set out in.
Nice. So, well, first of all, I think we should get Nowhere to Code to sponsor this podcast, because we just did a bunch of plugins for them, but they're doing great work for the community.
Yes.
I know Jason, and we've had like 5 different people from Nowhere to Code on the show, so they're really invested, and their intention is very pure. It's not like they're trying to make money. They need to make money to sustain, but they're great contributors to the community. So we all thank them for their contribution. And it's cool to hear that. So I'm curious just because you mentioned it. So did you look at Netbox before when you had the previous job or previous project and decide not to use it, or was that not mature enough, or you maybe they were not aware in the community at the time, and now they're just kind of grown up?
At the time when it was recommended to us, the person who recommended it had experience with both.
Mhm.
And at the time, if I remember correctly, I think Netbox's limitation was they were sticking with the one purpose philosophy for the tool, like DSIM, like really good data center infrastructure management.
Yeah.
Right. And they weren't super open to extending it to do things like, network automation straight from the Netbox tool. And, I don't think it's that way now. But, I mean, for the most part, it was just recommended that we use Nautobot if we're interested in automation. And so we're like, all right, let's go that way.
Kind of a philosophical difference that, I mean, I understand both sides. Like you want to do one thing well, which is kind of, like somebody, one school of thought, and the other is, hey, you already have these, and let's make it more enterprise friendly, and let's solve more problem with this existing tool. Both are valid, and as we saw, these are open source projects, so you're free to take them in either directions. And just like you have Red Hat, which is more conservative, and then you have the Fedoras, right? So what are your thoughts about on that train, or if you have anything to add for this new second generation of the tool set, Christian?
Yeah, I think it's interesting you point out the philosophical differences between the two. I think there's space for both, right? They both have their use cases. But just for us, really focused on network automation, Nautobot seemed to be the clear choice. I mean, right out of the gate, we made heavy use of the Golden Config plugin, which was great for us pushing configurations to devices, as well as, just single source of truth for network config data. It seems to be right in line with that goal.
Nice. So what are some of the specifics that you could mention on, we heard about the architecture, and do you want to run us through like kind of the improvements of the second generation tool that you kind of V2 of that V1 tool?
Sure. I want to quickly outline Nautobot and some of the things that are tangentially related to the automation stuff.
Yeah,
and of
perfect.
course, Nautobot here needs no introduction, but I'll give it a short one anyway.
Sure. No, please do. I think I for one are not very familiar with all the features or the latest. So please do give us a great introduction for that.
So at its core, it's a data center infrastructure management platform, right? It stores all your data. So you have site data, you have rack data, you can do your rack elevations, you can create device objects, cable data, you can plug this thing into this other thing, and you can do things like cable traces, and all your inventory, all your infrastructure inventory is sort of documented in one place, right?
Yep.
And it's the single source of truth for these types of data. The configuration data aspect of it is really nice as well. I can go to a device object and I can see all the interfaces. I can see all the VLANs. I can see all the VLANs in a site. I can see the prefixes in a site, so on and so forth. So really automation friendly. Now, when I started this, I was thinking, all right, I personally am, I really like Nornir.
Yeah.
So I started a project where I would, write some Nornir plays where they would run locally on my machine. They would pull down the configuration data from Nautobot, right? Populate some variables, run them through a Jinja template, and then configure a device. Somewhere in that process, I discovered a plugin, right? Christian already mentioned Golden Configuration that does this locally inside of Nautobot. So I immediately scrapped my project and was like, let me get this thing installed and see what it can do. And sure enough, there's an integrated, they've integrated GraphQL. And so this plugin leverages GraphQL to query your data, right? Give me the config data set for every device.
Yeah.
Run it through Jinja templates that are stored in GitHub, right? There's also an integration to GitHub, which is super nice. Render the config, render the intended config, and then store it with the device object.
Nice.
So at any time, I can go to a device and I can look at its backup config. I can look at its intended config. And then there's this third feature that is compliance, like config validation. And I can use that to see the deltas between my running config and my intended config. Ideally, there would be none. That's kind of the check. That's like the validation process.
Yeah.
So that's like the cornerstone of configuration automations, having those elements. Now, the last piece was actually pushing an intended config to a device.
Yeah.
So we extended it just with, I don't know, less than 100 lines of Python probably. We just wrote a Nornir task to push the intended config to devices.
Yeah.
Right. And it can be done at scale, right? A user can select one device from inventory, or all devices in a site, or all devices, in our inventory, and run this task for all devices simultaneously, right? Nornir supporting threading. And so that's kind of the complete solution that we're using. We're still developing some of the workflows around it, but all the pieces work great, and we're getting good adoption.
Yeah. Anything to add there, Christian?
Yeah, maybe just to give an idea of a little bit more of the workflow, we're also at Northeastern in the middle of network refresh, or kind of in the early stages of network refresh, replacing access switches and aggregation tier routers. So we're kind of taking that as an opportunity to onboard those devices into Nautobot and then drive the configuration from Nautobot, as part of the replacement process. So kind of what that looks like is we have some Python code that can take the existing old infrastructure, the access switches, for example, and import that data into Nautobot. There's some nuances, of course, with the backend logic of that, because there's some old bad configs that we actually just want to ignore. Leave those behind. We don't want to import those into Nautobot because they're not good. And then there's differences between platforms and things like that as well that we have to handle. But we import the existing config data from the existing access switches into Nautobot, and then we can create a new device, copy the data over, and then we can deploy it to the new switches that are going to be the replacements, right? So that's sort of the workflow that we're using now. And taking this, like you said, greenfield sort of, network refresh, router replacement as an opportunity, because it's a lot easier than truing up our old configs to just push new, good, clean configs from Nautobot to the new devices.
Yeah, that's always, Harry, that's actually what I was going to ask, because this is public information, but in some of the environments I've had, you would be surprised that people would just write the new config in the startup config, for example, and then just reboot the box. They don't really care what's out there in a running config and at the surprise frequency, just because that's easier. And that usually leaves a bad taste in people's mouth. But anyways, it's kind of this thing that's complicated, and people have chosen different routes based on, again, philosophical differences. But it's, in this case, you guys were doing greenfield refresh. I'm curious, what would have done if it was, kind of an existing device where you have to get it into the intended state, for example, right? What kind of, maybe a pseudocode, right? What would you do?
That's a good question. And that's actually one of the projects on our books.
Okay.
And we have the machinery there to do that, right? The architecture I described earlier kind of accounts for greenfield and brownfield.
Yeah.
The key piece for the brownfield automation, or basically the workflow, is, we import the device's data into Nautobot. Now it's structured data, and we only import the pieces we care about, like Christian was saying. But then we turn right around and we redeploy the new intended configuration right back out to that box. Mm-hmm. And all the generational configs that have drifted over time, they're all gone, and it instantly gets all the new updated current configs.
Got it.
So that's basically the process. And we just try to minimize the collateral damage, right?
It's all right. The blast radius is known, right?
Right.
This is that one device, and I imagine even if it's, parallelism, but you're still kind of known.
Yeah. I mean, accounting for the nuances was a huge part of the effort, right?
Yeah.
You can't miss that one setting that only exists on, a small subset of our device inventory, because if you miss that setting, then, you break users.
Yeah.
So just another tidbit there is really try to reduce your nuance in configurations, like Snowflake configurations, Snowflake networks, like artisanal networks. are really, they add a lot of time to the automation effort.
Yeah. What about you, Christian? Anything to add there?
Yeah, Anthony touched on it a bit there that, for brownfield deployment, we're pulling in the configs in an Autobot, but there's some configs that we don't want, right? They're old, they're bad. And,
Yep.
Coming from, our network architect has kind of laid out what our new configuration should kind of look like generally. And it's drastically different from the old ones. We're making a lot of changes. So the issue is when you've imported some data, you're rendering a new config for your box, you see a lot of differences if you look at the intended versus running config. So now we're trying to kind of work out, well, how do we make sure that we're not breaking things for users? How do we make sure that the same VLANs are still on the same user ports?
Yeah.
How do we make sure that after the deployment that, all the ports are still up and, they're learning MAC addresses, for example. So
Yeah.
we've written some scripts to kind of parse through some of that data and look at, pre and post and validate things, but we're still working through that process and trying to streamline what some of those operational checks look like.
Yeah, it seems like that 20/80 rule, right? Like you really spend just 80% of your time on those 20% of nuances. This just leads me to reminded me of situations where like the leadership would say, hey, we have we have like a multi-vendor, like a 2-vendor place, and they compete with each other. We get great pricing. They would get the feature pushed through faster just because they're competing. Why don't we go for 3 or 4 or 5, right? Like, let's go crazy on this and we'll save gazillion dollars. And that's just to your point, both of your points about it costs money. It costs people's time spend and brain cells just to accommodate all those little nuances, differences. I mean, when would be the day where everybody conforms on this one model where I just like do it? But I don't know, right? I don't have an answer for that. But the current existing situation is what you guys described. It's just all these little nuances. Like I cannot have it in the front. I have to give a pain in the back.
Speaking of, I would really like to insert a call to action here for vendors who are pushing network operating systems that don't support config replace. Please implement this feature on all your switches. I feel like any good modern operating system should have that feature.
Yeah.
I mean, there are other ways to deal with it, right? To reconcile between running and intended if you don't have a replace option. Like there's a repo out here called hierarchical config, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't used it, but it's a good tool to have in your toolbox if you must. But config replace is just so clean, so reliable. Please implement that in your operating.
All right, so you heard it here, like vendors. If you don't have config replace, you're not getting Anthony and Christian's dollar.
we evaluate that as we've sold this architecture internally so much so that as we evaluate new products to bring in, does this thing support config replace? And if it doesn't, then it kind of goes at the bottom of the list.
Yeah. Well, any additional thoughts there, Christian?
Yeah, and I mentioned it earlier, but just to reiterate, config replace and also the ability to retrieve structured data from the device in some way.
Oh my God, yeah.
Configs. Let me get some JSON data or something like that via RESTconf, or even if it's XML from netconf, something. Just give me structured data.
Yeah, so let me put out that structure, the spreadsheet, right? Like you're not getting their dollar if the structured data, which I feel like it should just be universal, right? Like if you made it in 1982, fine, right? But like, if your box is made after 2010, you should have structured data, even if you just pretend. Like I don't care if you put some bubble gums and duct tapes and just give me that, but so I could, like you could improve on, right? Just have something, then you could improve on later on. But those two, I feel, yes, those are definitely the musts. So, I think you guys mentioned it in the conversation where the lessons learned and for this day 2 project. And by the way, how long has it been since you guys were like just conversing and whiteboarding until like version 2 project? How long is it within 2 years?
I think so. Maybe 2.5 years.
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay.
About 2 years.
So that is super fast, right? I've been in situations where that like just whiteboarding alone takes about 6 months, and then let alone writing the code right before like the first git commit. It's just whiteboarding and design thinking and so on, the UX exploration. But yeah, so that's awesome.
I can add some additional context there. Like,
Please.
it wasn't just happenstance that we were able to get it done so quick. There were definitely some factors that directly led to that outcome. One, the network we were in the first time was not, it was pretty artisanally crafted, but we didn't have exotic configuration requirements. We didn't have exotic topologies. Like, it was pretty simple and straightforward, which is a good thing, right? It met it met the institutional's business goals for the network. It was good enough. It was minimum viable config for the most part.
Right.
So
flat layer 2 everywhere.
It wasn't quite.
Just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Oh, the PTSD. No, we're actually currently dealing with that. So that's a fun one. But yeah, the UGA did a great job designing their network. It was, layer 3 OSPF, and then for the extensions, we ran a BGP or EDP and overlay with iBGP. It was great.
Yeah. I didn't mean to cut you off, but please continue on the kind of the thought process there.
We didn't have to digest a mountain of nuance, right?
Yeah.
So that was the first thing. And then the second thing is our leadership, the one that was willing to open a position on the team for a dedicated automation engineer. He's the same leader that gave us the time to do the experiments and the learning and the development and so on and so forth, right? And he didn't really like give us really tight deadlines or anything like that. Like, he understood sort of the process that you have to go through to get to the other side of an initiative like this. So those two things were really key in the speed of our delivery. Yeah.
Well, anything to add there? I mean, just besides the timeline and more, maybe add a little bit more color to it, Christian?
Yeah, I mean, I think Anthony hit the nail on the head with everything he said. The environment and, the support from leadership, and the fact that we had, interest and buy-in from other team members as well who were interested in automation. Like, all of those things came together to, help facilitate these projects that we were working for.
And I think that came from leadership and culture, right? Because if you don't have the support of the higher ups, and people start to deprioritize this, even if they think it's important, they just have so much on their plate, and that they just can't spare the time of day to talk to you about, how about this config change that they need to do.
Right. Exactly. Shout out to Jeff Farisi for being a great leader.
Yes, shout out to Jeff. I'm giving him like 2,000 thumbs up and likes. I'm just that just having the guts and the the giving the green lights for everything that you guys have done over there.
Exactly. Yeah. And a quick note, I meant to mention this earlier, but after our first iteration, the first big project, once we got it off the ground and people were using it, I went to try and get some feedback.
Yeah.
For the operations team that were using it. We didn't really have a ton of communication with them. But there was one guy in particular who was like, I saw what you guys were doing, and I was like, we don't need to do that. Like, we just, I can configure switches like way faster. Like, I'm
right.
I'm the config champion. But then he's like, I started using it, and I was like, oh, like, I was done in like 30 minutes. Normally this takes me like a couple of days, and I have to fix things after the fact. But when you use this process, it comes out, the same way every time, and it just works. Yeah. So that was, we got a lot of buy-in by generating this thing that was user-friendly and had high value. Like, we focused on that first.
Yeah. I like the fact that you mentioned that, because like, the design choice was to functional, and the design choice was to be maybe not the win design award like what Christian was saying, but it's functional and it offers value to people, and it's to the config champion of the world that they really appeals to them, right? Like, you could spend all day doing this, but last time I checked, there's no like Tor engineer out there, right? Or like nor will be in the future. You might be able to do this now today, but it's not going to be happening tomorrow. So why don't we all get on this train? And then so now you could get off work at 5 and go watch your son play soccer, or like not get paged at 2 a.m. in the morning. Or if you do, you actually have a few backups and a new source of truth to check on and know what changed. So those are kind of the lessons that I took away when I was doing a similar process. So I'm happy that you brought that up and you got the actual feedback from the user.
Yep, definitely. You nailed it. All those points are really great.
Yeah. So I think those were, I mean, unless you have anything else to add, I mean, we could start talking about like how just kind of broaden up the scope, right? Like how can people get started with automation? I mean, those are very specific project, and I think we need more of these case studies, right? And I think that's one of the reasons that you reached out, Anthony, to want to share this with people. And I'm very, very happy and glad that you did that, because this is sorely needed in the field today. It's just like, hey, I've done this, and here are the steps I took, here are the lessons I've learned, here's how you could do it in your environment too.
Exactly. When we were first looking, there's a plethora of power tools out in the wild. Here's how you can automate VLAN changes. Here's how you can automate this, that, so on and so forth. But and I think there probably is some content around structural solutions, but I wanted to inject another structural solution. Like here's a well architected, or in my opinion, this is an opinionated solution, right? For a well architected config automation effort, right?
Yeah.
I think over time hopefully we'll start seeing more of those and less of the the one-off scripts, how to do a thing, oh wow, that's neat, right? I think over time the ecosystem will have a few like really well architected solutions at some point. I don't know when that is. It might be 10 years, it might be 20 years, it might be 3 years, but
let's hope not. I don't think I could wait that long, man. Like
yeah, but our solution
might be.
Yeah, this one's open source. It's actually pretty low code for the whole end-to-end process. And I mean, we got some of our code originated with I got it from somebody I met on the Network to Code Slack. He was like, oh, check out these jobs that I have that will configure your devices. And I was like, well, that's perfect. That's the last piece we needed. So that's the only bit of Python that we've actually injected into the process. Everything else is out of the box, and you just configure the system according to the directions, and you have a pretty robust solution.
Yeah. What about you, Christian? How can people get started on with network automation? So I think Anthony mentioned about looking at the tools that's out there, and it seems like it cover 80%, and that's only like the last 20%, and you kind of customize that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I agree with Anthony. I mean, look at these tools, play around with them, Netbox and Notabot, and I'm sure there's other out there, but also
I don't think so. But, I mean, I please prove that I'm wrong. I would like to know more tools, but yes,
there may be a few like Blueware, for example. I don't have much experience with Blueware, but look at these tools. Also, just play around with Python and Ansible, and I recommend automate some simple things. I know early on, one of the first tasks I automated was I think our manager wanted to see what ports on our access switches had been down for more than 30 days or something like that.
Yeah.
So I wrote a simple Python script. It may have been between 100 and 200 lines, something, or not very long, to just pull that data in and report on it, generate like a CSV report that I could provide to management. Right. So think about some of those things that you maybe are kind of tedious for you now, if you're doing manual network operations, and think about how you might automate some of those simple things to kind of get your brain in that automation space.
Yeah, I like that too. So, I mean, it's true about structure solution, like what Anthony was saying. Like these are the structure steps that in an opinionated way that you could do, but don't overlook these pointed solutions too, because that's how you get the little wins and those kind of encouragement that you would get from just in these inevitable walls that you will hit into, right? Like I'm the same way. Like, I mean, the first big encouragement that I got was there's like a vendor bug where they're not coming out with a solution anytime soon, where I just have to go reload the boxes periodically just to bring it back into a clean state. And back then, I wrote a few lines of code and then just did just that. Obviously, we have redundancies and failovers and all of that, but I was so surprised and so encouraged by that these developers were using my little script tool to accomplish that, and that gave me the necessary juice to move on and learn more. So these little wins are super important, and I like that about automate the simple things. But to your point, Anthony, like really structure solution that's end to end, that go from like zero to something that's useful. More case studies like that, please, do share. And I'm so glad that you took the time to actually organize your thoughts and share the knowledge. It's not always open. Let's just say that, right?
Yes, definitely. I would like to push my blog here. That's
Yes.
one of my resolutions was to write more and do some public speaking this year. So the first series that I've written about was sort of this architecture and the fundamentals, right? The fundamental components of the architecture, right? Things that are good for you to know, right? Learn structured data, why it's important, learn templating, and then learn, some config management tool like Nornir or Ansible or something like that. Those are like the fun. You can do everything we've talked about with just those three things. So learn those things, and then like the final parts of the series will be, the Notabot solution and the extension with jobs and so on and so forth. So if you follow it from end to end, the idea is you'll have a working solution.
Yeah, I checked out. Obviously, we'll have it in the show notes. I checked out your blog, and that was from JavaScript, right? Like, we're not, just kidding. No, it's very clean, so that's probably not JavaScript. I like how it's laid out.
Actually,
yeah, that's what I was getting at.
Yeah.
So, anything to add, Christian?
No, I think Anthony hit the nail on the head.
Okay, cool. So besides the blog, where else can people find you? Do they follow you on Twitter, or just the blog as the main thing?
I'm on LinkedIn as well.
Okay.
I'm trying to stay off too much social media these days, so keeping it down to LinkedIn and in my blog.
Yeah, you and I both, man. So what about you, Christian? Where can people find more of your work, or they want to get in touch with you?
Yep, check me out on LinkedIn, and I have a blog as well. I just put out my first blog post on there talking about effective coding, just how to write cleaner, better code, and I'm going to turn that into a series, so expect more of that.
Nice. Where is that at? Is that on Medium, or is that on your own sites, like Hugo, like what Anthony did, or?
That's on I have a GitHub Pages site, so that's what I'm using.
Yeah, I see more and more people do that, and I like that very much on how well maintained that is. So that's great. I need to check out both, of course.
Excellent. Yeah, and the GitHub page is very easy to get started with. So low barrier to entry there.
Yeah, great. So thank you guys again for being on the show. I really enjoy our conversation, especially the authenticity, right? Like I don't think I could express enough gratitude toward that. It's just being real, and these are truly happened, and walk us through your thought process. So thanks again for being on the show, guys.
It was great. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for listening to the Network Automation Nerds podcast today. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and all the other major podcast platforms. Until next time, bye-bye.